Translation. How many of our favorite books have we read in translation? We are told that in the 1960s, 20% of all books published in this country were in translation, and that by 2000, the year 2000, that number had shrunk to 7%. I can't think of my early reading life without Beckett, Ionesco, Camus, Simone de Beauvoir, Beesback, Pasternak, Marguerite Duras, or our literary world now without Bolaño or Zabor. We are here to celebrate Marie Chaix's 21st century arrival into English. Harry's going to speak more about this event, but it was through his translating Marie Chaix's first book, The Laurels of Lake Constance, an explosive bestseller in France in 1974, that Harry met its author. They have now been married for how long?
We've been together for 37 years.
They've been together for 37 years. The power of translation. I met the extraordinary American poet, novelist, Harry Mathews, when I first came to New York in 1969. I did not meet Marie until the early 1990s in Florida, and I consider her a close and dear friend. But I don't really speak or read French very well, and so I did not read her. Now, in reading Harry's revised translation of Laurels and his new translation of its companion volume of 1976, Silences, or A Woman's Life, I realize I hardly knew her at all. Which is lucky in a way, because I am so stunned by this writer, my friend, that had I read her when, what's going on? That had I read the books before we became friends, I would not have been able to utter a word in her presence, much less go jewelry shopping with her in Key West or gossip. I would instead have begged to kiss her feet. Having read her now as a writer laboring in parallel vineyards, I am grateful for her example and inspiration. The Laurels of Lake Constance is the story of a French family during World War II, when the father in that family is a Nazi collaborator. The book is preternatural, written chiefly from the perspective of the younger child of that father, as Marie Chaix was, who tries to make sense of a story that comes to her in shards of illumination, the extreme actions of adults and snippets, intonations of their talk, which only as an adult is she able to piece together. Though it was published as a novel, I read The Laurels of Lake Constance as a masterpiece of 20th century memoir in which a child's narrative voice and an adult's reflection and analysis merge in language that is gorgeously tumultuous and radiantly precise, in layers of narrative that also include the father's point of view from sources that seem to be primary, letters and papers and correspondence. None of us as children understand our parents' worlds, but usually the consequences of coming to that understanding as adults are not as cataclysmic as they were for Marie Chaix's narrator. The Laurels of Lake Constance was published in France in 1974 and here in 1977, and was succeeded in France in 1976 by Silences, or A Woman's Life, which, while not exactly a sequel to Laurels, takes up the same family, the same experience, the same narrator, here a grown woman. It is now published here for the first time by the wonderful Dalkey Archive Press, as is Laurels of Lake Constance. In this novel, memoir, the female narrator, an adult, works to recover the mother she knew as a child before the traumas of war and betrayal, and meditates on the nature of filial love between women as she waits through her mother's coma. Flashes of the experience recounted in the first book illuminate the canvas of her remembering as she tells a story that seeks to repair, through the expression of love, the cruel disruption in the details of female existence that bind a mother and daughter, wrought by how the husband-father chose to live in the male sphere. If I read these books as a single work, as I am tempted to do, they bring to mind Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, in which the first section tells a story. Time passes in the short second section, and in the third, a daughter figure returns to the scene of earlier emotion. Within Marie's narrator's mourning, I find resemblance to the to the passages in To the Lighthouse, in which the artist Lily Briscoe struggles to come to terms with the loss of Mrs. Ramsay, her spiritual mother. In her incomprehension at the father, I find resonance with Lily Briscoe's fury at Mr. Ramsay, Woolf's patriarch. These books are not simple transactions between women. Like Woolf, part of Chaix's subject is the impact of patriarchy on the lives of women. And like Woolf, Marie writes of childhood and war as a woman related by family and culture to the patriarchy responsible for that war. Woolf writes of Lily Briscoe, her artist persona, facing the act of creation in that context as a moment that, quote, brought her to tears and made this passage from conception to work as dreadful as any down a dark passage for a child. I cannot imagine how difficult writing these books must have been, and I am so grateful to Marie for risking them. Here again is Woolf as the painter Lily Briscoe, who begins a painting in the first pages of To the Lighthouse a decade earlier, is unable to finish it and finally returns to it at the end. She turned to her canvas. There it was, her picture. Yes, with all its greens and blues, its lines running up and down, its attempt at something. It would be hung in attics, she thought. It would be destroyed. But what did that matter, she asked herself, taking up her brush again. She looked at the steps. They were empty. She looked at her canvas. It was blurred. With a sudden intensity, as if she saw it clear for a second, she drew a line there in the center. It was done. It was finished. Yes, she thought, laying down her brush in extreme fatigue, I have had my vision. Please welcome first Harry Mathews and then Marie Chaix in celebration of the vision of these books of Marie's. Thank you. Okay? Yes. Do you want to stand or do you want to sit? Whatever you want.
I'd rather sit.
Okay. Perfect.
Many years ago, when I first presented Marie Chaix at the Key West Literary Seminar, I said it was like presenting Jimmy Buffett in Paris. Both people were very well known in their hometowns and their home countries, but virtually no one had heard of Marie Chaix, and I don't think many people in Paris, if any, had heard of Jimmy Buffett, who is in Key West. Of course, he's not only known for his music, but he has a famous bar, Margaritaville. Marie, it's not the same kind of fame as Jimmy Buffett's, but it is considerable. She published 10 books in France, all of which sold well, 4 of which are still in print. And to those of you involved in writing and publishing, you know that that's a rarity. And 2 of them were spectacular bestsellers. The first, her first book, for which she's still best known, The Laurels of Lake Constance, and a book which unfortunately I haven't translated, called Juliette, Chemin des Cerisiers. The Laurels is both an account of the life of a particular family before, during, and after the Second World War. as well as a reconstruction of its dominant figure, her father, who was a traitor. He collaborated. It was not just, there were lots of collaborationists in France. And when the peace was signed, everybody in France was a collaborator because they wanted the war to come to an end. But he was an active participant in this anti-Semitic fascist party, which was run by a man called Jacques Doriot, who was a seductive orator and a very clever man. Well, you should read the book to find out what happens, but in the end, he is saved by the American army. He's finally seen the light after extermination camps and horrors of many sorts. He finally understands that the people he has been working with for ever since 1935 are a bunch of gangsters. And he says, I'm through with them, a little late. Anyway, then he goes up to the top of a mountain and sets up a radio and communicates with the staff of the 7th Army, which is the American Army, which is coming up the valley of the Goerges, and saved, no doubt, a great many American lives. So he surrendered to the Americans. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, yes,
He
yes.
surrendered to the Americans, and he wanted to go back to France right away because he considered everything he'd done patriotic. And the Americans said, you know, you go back to France now, we're going to hold you prisoner for a while. And they held him prisoner for a year. He went back and was tried, and luckily escaped execution, and was condemned to life imprisonment, and then was released after 8 or 9 years through a general amnesty. What do you know? I may not have the second page of this. And I'll let Marie tell you how the book came into being and what it meant to her, but I'd only add, on its publication in France, the only attacks on it came from the right. That is to say, people who had been on her father's side. They thought she'd betrayed him. On the left, there was rejoicing, and I mean, it was serious. That, you know, it sold 80,000 copies in a country which had a population of about 50 million at the time. So that's a lot of copies for a country that size. And the people on the left, including the future president François Mitterrand, who wrote Marie a letter of thanks for having written the book, were very grateful because no one until then had spoken about what happened to families on the wrong side. And Marie knew very well that it was the wrong side, and she was disgusted by her father's politics. But she showed that even on the wrong side, a lot was going on. Everything was going on. You know, people were suffering. People were obviously not as much as others, but it was a world that had been taboo, and that Marie showed was as full of love and grief and humanity as any other. My first conversation with Marie Chaix was a long phone call that I initiated after finishing my first translation of the Laurels of Lake Constance. Long before that, I had become so involved with the members of her family that I longed to become a part of it. And that is one of Marie's most extraordinary gifts as a writer, is that she takes you into her intimacy. She takes you into her family. And at the end of our conversation, she asked if I would be in Paris. I was then living in Venice at the time. at the beginning of March, and said, it's the occasion of the publication of my second book, Silences of a Woman's Life. And I said, oh, that's wonderful, what's it about? And she said, it's about my mother's life seen from the moment when she was dying. And she never made clear that her mother had died in the first book. And I was shattered. I realized that I had counted on meeting her mother, who could sing and play the piano, and I sort of wanted to play Schubert four-hand music together. But not only she was dead, but all but one member of her family was dead. Fortunately, Marie was very much alive. So I solved the problem of joining her family by marrying her. And it is something that makes me very happy in presenting her to you. And I'll leave her the next words.
Okay. Shall I read first?
Do you
Or?
want to sit
No,
or
I think I stand.
Well, I think it was
What? You want to start?
just by your father.
Okay. You want me to first? Okay.
I would stand for the whole thing.
Mhm.
Get up and
You stand. Okay.
No, I don't need that.
There's a mic up there.
Yes, you need it for the television.
No, it's there.
No.
There's a mic.
Oh, I see. Okay. Way ahead of me.
It's my books, after all. I'm going to read a passage that takes place in 1946. But first, I'd like just to give you some hint about how I came to write that book, because my father died when I was 21 years old, and he had been living with the family about not even 10 years before that. Because he came out of jail, I was 11, and when he died I was 21, so just 10 years. And during the whole time he was with us at home, he never mentioned his action, never. And we didn't ask. And of course he talked about his past but it was always very anecdotic and never an explanation or justification or whatever. He wanted to become another man, and he wanted to be a father, which was not always very funny for us. And so that's to say, when he died, I had no idea about what he really had done during the time we didn't see him. And shortly after his death, my mother very, very solemnly came to me with a pile of little notebooks and said, so these notebooks were written by your father when he was in jail. It's not a diary, but it's the tale, you can say, no, the récit of what he's done. But please, don't tell anybody anything. So, and it took me some time to read these notebooks, because I didn't want to know. I think I didn't want to know what the truth was. And at that time, I had a Jewish friend, very good friend. She's still my best friend. And I was 20 when we met, 19, 20, and when my father died, so she asked me, but you never told anything about your father. So do you have any idea who he was? And I was like a parrot, like repeating things like, he was a collaborator, he was in jail, and she said, but why? Do you know why? And I said, no, I don't know why, never told. And she said, but you are absolutely crazy. Now you have these notebooks, you must read that stuff. So it took me some months to read that. And of course it was a terrible, terrible shock, because I didn't realize at what point he had been involved in the whole collaboration. You know, it was very, very hazy what I knew. Anyway, so that's how I started. Well, I had the idea of writing, but I never wrote anything before. But I thought, well, now I have a good story. That's my story. I'm going to start with this. And so I told everybody I'm going to leave Paris with my daughter was 2 years old at that time, and I had my first husband also. And we left, and everybody said, oh, she's completely crazy. She's, you know, you can't write a book like that just because you want to write a book. Anyway, I did. And actually, it's funny because I chose this passage, and I think it's the first scene I wrote when I was asked by. I worked for a time at a publisher and Le Seuil, but I was, you know, secretary in an office. I was a little employé, but I had told to my boss about what I wanted to read, and he asked me, but try to read a scene, try to read something. Start with one scene, and it's that scene I wrote the first time. And that scene is, it takes place in 1946, when my father actually came back from Germany, where, as Harry told you, he stayed in a camp there for 1 year, and didn't want to go to the States. He was proposed, the American army proposed him to take him to the States, and I think he would have worked for the CIA, you know, something like that. And he refused, and he said, no, I'm a French man, I'm a patriot, I will go back to my country, and I will explain what I did. So that's the scene when he comes back, but we didn't see him. You know, when he left, when I was 2 years old, in 44, I was born in 42, so in 44 he left for Germany. I have no recollection about that. And then this is 46, when, you will see. One spring day, when I was 4, I had to put on my plain dress with a white collar, solemnly wash my hands, comb my hair more carefully than usual, and abandon my games and the garden in Suresnes. 1, 2, 3 down Rue du Bel Air to the station. 4, 5, 6 hop on the train. Don't ask questions. Give me your hand. 7, 8, 9 Gare Saint-Lazare. Hurry up, we're late. At Rue des Saussets, I had to climb 3 flights of stairs. I'm tired. Don't squeeze my hand so hard, Maman. Why are you shivering? 10, 11, 12 open the door. A corridor, a waiting room, a large office. In the years to follow, hanging on to my mother's sure hand like a little shadow, I became familiar with so many corridors, so many waiting rooms, so many offices. They would all have the same smell of stale tobacco, dampness, and stacked papers, the same brownish, yellowing, mildewed walls, and the same enchantment of not being alone, of being able to get there, to go there, and live with her. She took me with her everywhere. She sat me on wobbly wooden chairs. Wait here for me. I'll be back. Draw me a baby rabbit in the forest. She settled me on Persian rugs in vast sitting rooms that smelled of floor wax. Now be very good. I have to talk to this gentleman. She buried me in the depths of velvet armchairs, in whose dusty odor I counted and recounted their gilded stars. With her, life was never less than beautiful. In the office on Rue des Saussets, there is a large table covered with ink spots and cigarette burns. In a swivel chair behind it sits someone rather dreary and rather polite, who says to us, "Wait, I send for him." He picks up the telephone and says, "Madame B is here with her little daughter." I think he's calling the doctor. I don't much like the idea, but I tell myself, I open my mouth, cough, 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 then a little pat on the back of my head, and bye-bye. Back to my games. The door opens. There are 3 of them. In the middle is someone rather dreary and rather nice. He comes toward us. Mother hasn't moved. I clutch her sleeve. I don't back away. He's very close to us. His eyes are moist. He's wearing a black tie and smells of lavender. Lavender. Mother throws herself at him with a cry that is new to me. Even her weeping at night doesn't produce that sound. She draws back from him, her face beaming with the light of a broad, unsteady smile. "Are you going to say hello?" To please her, I hold out my hands and say, "How do you do, sir?" My father picks me up in his arms and weeps quietly into my neck. "So it's you. I hadn't imagined you with those soft eyes. I thought you had a beard and a kepi, like the photograph from Aleppo in the green leather frame on the night table. You aren't scary," with a little smile. "Next time I'll give you a kiss." I touch his forehead. "You don't have much hair." He laughs. From now on, we'll see each other more often. I ask where he will sleep in our 2 tiny rooms. No, there's no question of that. One man is swiveling in the chair behind the desk, his nose buried in a filing folder. Filing? Excuse me. The 2 others are conversing in low voices without looking at us. He and she are smiling at each other. They whisper sweet words, touch, and look at me together, smiling, crying. Then we have to leave. It's time for parting and no longer seeing each other or touching each other for years to come. I keep waving goodbye all the way down the corridor. My father is standing in the doorway between his 2 guards, blowing me kisses. Mother walks faster and faster, 1, 2, 3 down the stairs and quickly into the street, the air, the sun. At the first pastry shop, she abruptly makes me go in. Without a word, we gorge ourselves on cake. So we can have questions later on, but I think I will read now a section out of the second book, which was called Silences of a Woman's Life. And it's really true. It's only when I wrote the last pages of the Laurels, I finished the book. I had no end to that book, and I didn't know how to write the end. And so my editor at the space said, "Well, you have to write something." So I wrote something, and finally, and then I thought, now I have another book to write. It's about her. And it was called Silences because of the silences of my mother. She never told me anything about what she had felt about her whole life with this impossible man. And it's true, I did ask, and it was common in the families. The people, I don't know if it's still the same now. I think it's different. I can see that with my 2 daughters. But at that time, nobody was asking you know, we even when I was 20 years old, I didn't ask, and she had such a miserable life that every time we said something about war, about loss, so she started to cry, and we didn't dare to ask her any question. My oldest brother, I must add that I had two older brothers, and one older sister, and my oldest brother died in Germany when he was 18 years old. He followed my father in 1944. He followed him in Germany, and they gave him a stupid mission, and he took a train, and the train never arrived. And that was the time in 1944 when all the German cities were bombarded like crazy. So anyway, we never knew what happened to him, but we knew he had died. So for my mother, it was really something very painful. And for the couple, you know, my mother and father, that was, I imagined that much later, it must have been absolutely excruciating, because he was his fault, you know, if my brother died. She must have thought that. I did. Anyway, when he came back, and as soon as he was with us, a year later, my mother had a stroke. She was 50 years old, and she had a bad stroke, and she stayed half paralyzed for the rest of her life. And at that time, I was I was a teenager. I was 14 years old, and I stayed here. I was the last one, so I was the one who lived with my mother and my wonderful nanny, Juliette, who took care of her until her death. Anyway, so I might read just one short passage about her, just to understand in what state she was. Her old age had caught us unprepared. One day, when she was still youthful, something, perhaps some grief too intense to be borne, made her stumble, and for many a long day go blank. Coma was the medical term for this passage through the land of mists. Against every expectation, the sleeper then came back to life, a life on which she opened her eyes without recognizing it. Henceforth, she would walk with a cane. She would never again run her fingers over the keys. Oh, everything she now would lack was too much to take in at a glance. But she would have plenty of time to think about it, now that she was old. In a matter of days, for her countless centuries of sleep, she had gone to the end of the bleak sunset path where people usually adopt successive disguises, planning stops along the way so as to ultimately get used to the imperceptible changes that from year to year transform them into other people. She woke up from her journey, tired and wobbly, astonished at having become that someone else, that person of the far side of things, on the downhill side of things, the nebulous ghost that waits for each of us someplace else, farther on, later, but inescapably there, with white hair, sunken eyes, slow gestures, the shawl worn all year round. For a long time she refused to look in a mirror. She would mumble, "What do I look like? What's happening? Half my face feels like marble." Did she sometimes think better not to have woken up? She never let on. To all appearances, she was ready to play her new role of dignified old lady without a murmur. Having known her before, I still saw her youth amid the marks of age. Two women walked together on the frontiers of dream, sometimes losing sight of one another, sometimes reuniting and merging into one. In the depth of her unaltered gaze and grave voice, she fitfully summoned up the memory of the woman who had deserted her body, but now sprang forth, obscurely and fortuitously, in the glint of a green eye or the lilting sparkle of her words. I will stop here because I will, so it gives you an idea. So the next passage I'm going to read is about this is how my parents tried to reunite. And that takes place in, let's say, 54, when he was amnesty was, yes. One day at the beginning of spring, nonetheless, we heard a resounding "he's free," a ringing happy signal that echoed through the burgeoning branches. When an old dream becomes brutally real, it's hard to find a place for it in our daily lives. We think we are living in an anguish of waiting. Later we realize that it was the waiting that nourished our lives. In just such a way, darkness envelops and soothes the prisoner, send him out into the daylight, and he'll fall down blinded. She had lived through 10 years of painful separation, shielded in her prickly fidelity. How will she sustain the shock of reunion when the door opens onto blinding daylight? Whom will she see in front of her when after 10 years two solitudes meet? What can they say to one another? You have to see her that morning, a dry morning in Lorraine, pale and stiff in her black coat as she confronts the eastern spring, which is sharp enough to still feel like winter. Look at her, erect, sure of herself, scarcely shivering as she approaches the barbed wire of the sprawling prison camp where he has spent his last 2 years of detention. She's about to act out her lover's rendezvous. Her captive is being restored to her. Is my hair in place? She wonders. Am I still beautiful? Will he find me attractive tonight? Look at her in the pale April sunlight, standing immobile in front of the huge gateway, her gaze hard, indifferent to the two guards who are watching her. Look at her imperiously knotting her scarf, taking her compact out of her handbag, clicking it open, considering herself impartially, then powdering her nose, reddened by the wind. She thinks, I was 40. I was wife and mother. My body was soft and strong. And at that end of your crusades, you enjoyed coming back to me and my unalterable love. Now I have to disguise my gray hairs and the circles under my eyes. Will you recognize my body or even the way I look at you? Won't we frighten each other? It's been so long since we moved and thrilled and slept together. Which of us can consider the other without trembling, without swallowing his tears, without crying his distress in the depths of his soul? Which of us will be the first to break down? The gate opens. She sees him in the distance, in his tight-fitting old brown leather windbreaker. A small canvas bag swings from one arm. In the other he carries his white cat. He had a cat. He walks slowly and jerkily, counting the yards that separate him from a newfound world of other people. He weaves across the barren ground as if testing his legs, like a sailor ashore after a long crossing. The cigarette to one side of his smiling mouth trembles a little. He's getting nearer. She thinks. It's his way of walking. He hasn't changed. Her lips are frozen in a vague smile she cannot control. Her hands are clenched inside pockets too small for them. Today is the day he's coming back into my life, erect, proud, almost serene, as if he'd never had a worry. And now a woman who is me is about to fling herself into the arms of a man who is you. And for so long there's been nothing no warmth, no touching or love-making for so long, my love, nothing but emptiness. We shall never know, as from a yard away she beheld the man's face wavering through her tears, whether what she thought was, at last, or it's all over.
I'm thinking we should go right to questions from you all, because we don't have that much time, and then I'll kind of weave in and out, too. Who has a question?
Any old question, somebody ask a dumb question. Oh, wait, you won't ask a dumb question.
Marie, when your father was in prison for those 10 years, did your mother or you go and visit
Oh yeah,
him
that is
in jail?
part of the story, when, and I think that's why we survived. I mean, my sister and I, and my oldest brother, he didn't survive so long, but we too, because my mother never lied to us. So there was, at that time, there were a lot of politic prisoners, there were quite a lot. And later on I heard terrible stories about children, who were told, they were told that their father was in a journey, or he will come back soon, he's ill, even he's in hospital.
I see.
And my mother always said, your father is in jail, so we are going to visit him every week.
Did she say why he was in jail?
She said, yes, but politic prisoner was a very nice word.
She said he's a political prisoner. I see.
He's not a criminal.
He's a
Political. So politics, I never know. Political prisoner. And that was, for us, a child doesn't want
right. No, I get
doesn't
it.
want to know too much, and I didn't want to know more than that. So he was in jail. He was behind this gate. Bars? But it was not bars, it was kind of anyway, so but we went every week. It took us like an hour to go there from where we were. It was yeah.
Yes.
How long did your mother survive after the stroke?
So she had a first stroke when she was 51. She survived for almost 20 years. And 10 years, well, like 9 years while my father was still alive. Then he died. He died young. He was not even 60. He was almost 60. And then she survived 9 more years, which was really incredible because she was a tough woman.
So Marie, you didn't know about what your father had done during the war until you started reading the diaries.
Yeah.
So, and your mother was not alive then?
Yes, she was.
She was. So could you ask her then?
But I didn't.
Not even when you were reading the diaries?
Oh, at that time. No, because she said, oh my God, don't tell anybody. And so I asked her, why are you giving me that papers? Because somebody in the family must keep track,
But how did it feel for you as you gradually found out what your father had done?
It was terrible. I mean, it was awful.
And who did you share that with? Your Jewish girlfriend?
Yes, or not with my sister, because my sister didn't want to hear anything about it. And I talked to my mother, but it was never, the answer was never precise. How can I say that? She thought, she did try to impose, but she described the situation as if it was terrible what happened in France. It was terrible what happened to the people, to our country, but nobody understood my father. Nobody understood him. He was not that bad. So for us, he was a kind of victim.
Well, it's one of the things I admire so much about the way the Laurels of Lake Constance is written is somehow those sets of attitudes are embedded in the language. That, in the way the others talk. I mean, not the consciousness of the narrator, but everything's all right, everything's going to be fine, we're going to go.
Well, yes, because it's as a child, I was not told things. I was told, okay, put your coat on and we'll go to see the lawyer, or we'll go to see this, that, and so that was natural for me as a little girl. It was normal.
But have your mother read the notebooks?
Oh, that I don't know.
No?
I don't know. I think so. Yeah. Yes, she. That's why I call the second book The Silences, because she never expressed herself, and her whole life was like silent. And it was also a question of generation, and he never wanted her to be conscious about the life he had. He was about her action. She was not supposed to know. Because he was, he had his man thing.
Speaking of, I wanted to just insert this question. These are both published as novels, but what do you mean by that?
I don't read anything. That's the publisher at that
I
time.
see, okay.
It's a long time ago. It was 74.
Yeah, in those days, a memoir
But
was
look,
not saleable.
We didn't know what memoir was, and
Yeah.
I didn't want that to be called a novel. Because the Laurels, you could, but everybody knew it was not a novel. But
Well, and you have I'm reminded of Goerges, the Lover, which essentially is a memoir also.
of course, yes.
So I just wanted to clear that up. I mean,
Yeah,
that's what I
it's
that's what
not
I
my idea.
assumed.
No, it's what they called in France auto-fiction.
Yeah.
It's terrible. It's a terrible word. Yes.
Marie, I've only read these two books, but they're beautiful and they appear to be so fragmentary, this impression and that impression, and yet when you're finished with them each, they hold together so beautifully, so as though you have plotted it. And I wondered, did you have an outline, or does this just come to you and you write this part and then that part?
That's the mystery of writing, my dear. No, but that you're right. I started like that. I mean, I was not a writer. I didn't even know I could write. So when I had these notebooks and I thought, I have a story, I'm going to work on that. I had no idea how to do it, and but I found that writing scenes would help me. And so it's like a patchwork, I wrote different scenes at different times, and then I filled the holes with history.
Because it is chronological. I mean,
It is,
chronology keeps
and
it together.
during 1 year I read all the books I could read about that period, and because I didn't want to, that was my father's notebooks, but there were many mistakes.
Well, you have to contextualize.
Yes, yeah.
You may have read all the books about the period, but you still got the movements of the American Army wrong.
That's true. That's to say what translator he is. When he first called me on the phone to say, I'm your translator, and then he said, well, there are some things strange in your... Are you sure about this? Are you sure about that? And especially about the movement, American Army. How did I know about it? I didn't even know there was a movement in the American Army. I'm sorry. But I had them going north,
No, you
west,
had them approaching from the east. And at the east was the Mediterranean Sea. They were coming up to Provence.
yes.
So you fixed that.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
That's my question, Harry, both to you and to Marie, is talk about Marie's presence in your work as a translator. It's a fascinating one to think about.
She is a translator.
Her presence in your work as the translator.
My presence in your work.
As the translator, yeah. I mean,
Of
how
her,
is
you mean-
I translated some books of yours.
Yes, you
remember?
did.
Yeah.
So talk a little about that collaboration. I mean, that's interesting.
It's
that you're-
another collaboration.
But, you know, the relationship that begins with your translating her book, and you more or less...
Yeah.
Translate each other, yeah.
Yeah.
No, and Marie's always been absolutely adorable and said, oh, it's... I mean, yesterday she said to me, oh, it's so much better in English. And I said, you know...
Oh, I said that very often.
I mean, my concern
Yeah.
was to stay out of the way, you know, not do anything.
No, but
show-offing.
you're asking about my presence in his book.
Yeah. and
Well,
then
he
trans-
forced me to translate it.
No, I don't want to talk about Harry's work. I want to talk about the way in which, I mean, when you're working, Harry, as a translator, and you turn
Of her
work, and
of
you
her-
turn to her and say, "This is what I've done." What do you say?
It's wonderful.
Which is a safe thing to say.
Well, it was. I mean, I worked. It's a lot. I don't know if you've done translation.
Of course.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you know how hard it is.
Yeah.
And since Marie had this extraordinary gift of welcoming the reader into her intimacy, I realized just these last few days that my main preoccupation was staying out of the way. You know, don't be clever, don't show off, don't do anything that will get in the way of this extraordinary gift. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
And so it was, I have to make a parenthesis. I mean, I did a lot of work. I mean, I translated there's another book coming out called The Summer of the Elder Tree, which will be out sometimes next summer. We're not quite sure, but that's dorky archive for you, right? Who have been very, very good to me. But Marie, I tried to explain to Marie how much I wanted her to be present in America, you know, my country.
And here we are.
And Marie was cool to the point of coldness. I mean, she didn't really care. You know, so when she said my translations were wonderful, you know, I could. Anyway, I was very grateful that she was easygoing. I was a horror to translate when she translated me.
But I want to know, did you translate it and then present her with the manuscript, or did you give her it chapter by chapter?
Oh, no. I didn't want to read what he was doing. He
translated it.
No, the first book he translated, we didn't know each other at that time. And I barely spoke English. I mean, I was not able to check anything. And for the second book, I can't remember, but even some years ago, no, I didn't want to look at it. No, I'm reading it actually now, the second book. And that's why I was telling him it's wonderful, because I always think it's better when you know the language. I don't know why.
Wouldn't you like to know how I met Marie?
Yeah. Yeah.
I was living in France in 1970 full time, and I became great friends with Georges Perec, who many of you know, I assume. And we became great friends immediately. First evening we met. 5 vodkas and a couple of bottles of wine. I mean, it'll do it. And we got along very well, both in terms of our literary tastes and so forth. Anyway, he ended up translating my second and third novels, which were horrors to translate. I mean, they were full of tricky word games, and he did a brilliant job in both cases. And I wanted to return the favor, and I did. I translated a couple of movies he collaborated on, but I couldn't get a publisher in America to publish his big wonderful works like Memory of Childhood, and of course, Life He Uses Manual. Once he was dead and he'd become very famous in France, then it was much easier to do, but it happened after he was dead. And so I wasn't able to show my gratitude to him in that way. And one of my efforts to do better by him was to translate several chapters of W, or the Memory of Childhood, W, Le Souvenir d'Enfance. The most impressive book he had by then written, this was in the mid-70s. I gave my sample chapters to my agent in New York to show to various publishers with a view to bringing out the entire work. And once again, I failed in my objective. However, Richard and Jeanette Seaver said, although they couldn't publish Goerges' book, they were very impressed by my translations, and they wondered if I could do another book called Les Lauriers du Lac de Constance by someone called Marie Chaix. And somehow it had passed me by. I mean, it was a terrific hit in France, but I wasn't living in Paris, and it may have happened to, when I was away from town. Shortly afterwards, I went back to Venice, and shortly after I returned to Venice, and there read The Laurels through twice. The book was beautiful and moving, and you know what it's all about. I was also singularly affected, not only by the book, but by a photograph of the author on the back cover of the original edition. My first wife had left me in 1960. It was a devastating experience. 2 years later, I had a beautiful and devoted American woman as my companion, and with her at my side, I should have been a perfectly happy man. But my terror of the possible end of our affair, and my again being subject to the misery I had experienced from my marriage collapse, made me compulsively shy away from entering another long-lasting relationship. We began living separately and agreeing to leading independent lives, a tricky situation at best. For several years, I became a semi-secret ladies' man, having affairs with admirable women whom, no matter how admirable, I carefully kept at arm's length. My companion eventually gave up, finally, and went back to New York. The photograph of Marie Chaix on the back cover revealed a woman of 32 and great attractiveness. When John Ashbery first saw her, he remarked how pretty she was, then corrected himself immediately. No, not pretty, beautiful. Her beauty was not that of any stereotype. Strong-featured, full of energy and passion. From the start, I fantasized about having one of my non-committal affairs with her. I knew ahead of time that I was safe from any deeper involvement since she was married and the mother of 2 children, 2 little girls. What I did not know was that she had never cheated on her less faithful husband, but now felt inclined to indulge in a small infidelity of her own. Our interest in one another had preceded our meeting 2 months before in the hope of one day winning her. I had composed a 4-page handwritten letter intended for her, in which I deployed every seductive wile my experience as a writer could supply. I was pleased with the results and confident that they would dispose Marie to think of me as someone more than her translator. It then occurred to me that this was a shabby way to approach the woman I had come to know in her book, an intensely serious and compassionate human being who had generously taken her readers into the intimate, moving world of her feelings. I tore up my handwritten letter and replaced it with a page containing a dozen typed lines of a formality for which written French is perhaps uniquely capable. Madame, I have the honor and pleasure of being the translator of your admirable book. This was the letter I mailed her. Marie's reaction was not what I had foreseen. Her first impulse, she later told me, was to drop everything and get on the next train to Venice. She wanted to see this mysterious American who had unexpectedly appeared in her life. It was as though my original letter had been encrypted in its typewritten replacement. This, incidentally, delighted me as definitive proof of the superiority of classical restraint in writing to the rhetoric of expressionistic alertness. Our next contact occurred a month later. There's the phone call we've both spoken about before. And I didn't say that when I found out that her mother had died, I didn't say much of the migraine, did I?
No.
No. I mean, after I found out that her mother had died, I got the worst migraine of my life, a real 5-hour migraine, you know, curtains down, lying on my bed, and then I realized that I should know how to deal with things like this, and I took a look, and I realized that I was indulging in unjustified mourning. You know, how can you feel grief for someone you've never even seen? But that was the effect of learning about Alice's death, Marie's mother. In early March 1976, Marie began visiting me on successive afternoons in my tiny apartment on the Rue de Varennes. Her first visit revealed that we were each drawn to the other. On the second, we kissed. On the third, our affair began. In both our minds, it was an affair of pleasure with no thought of serious consequences. But our affair did not proceed as I expected. Marie returned home, then came back to Paris to see me. We found ourselves in love, gradually but inexorably slipping into the realization that we were meant to stay together forever or something like it. I went back to Venice for the summer to wind up my life there. Marie would come and fetch me in early September. As planned, she drove her Volkswagen Kombi to Genoa. I came to meet her by train. In the main station of the city, I found a woman in tears, full of fury and shame at having abandoned her family. She would not listen to reason or reaffirmations of love. I then had the sense to take her for lunch to a good restaurant. And there, gratifying food and a bottle of wine began calming her anguish. She drove to Venice, where the next day I loaded all my gear into the Kombi, and we set off for France, picking up her two daughters and their grandparents on the way to my house in the mountains, where we lived for the next 10 years. Since then, we have lived in Paris, in New York, in Bennington, Vermont, and finally in Key West. We married in 1992, after 16 years of life together. A long engagement, that's called. That life began on September 6, 1976. It's not over yet.
Well, that's it, I think, for our evening. And now, Marie, you have to translate that letter.
No, I have to write my version.
Thank you very much.
My books, if you want. Oh, they're books.